Everybody, Luke Gromen, FFTT. Hope everybody had a great weekend here in Ohio. It was a beautiful weekend, and so even though high school baseball season's been canceled, I was able to go up with my middle son, and yesterday we hit some fungos, got some outfield practice in, some batting practice, and a couple hours yesterday. Did the same thing again today, and a high school teammate of his joined him up at the field, and so was able to shag some flies. He was able to shag some flies. I was able to watch, and so they were able to keep their social distancing hundreds of feet away, so that's the important thing. So with that as preamble, let's jump right in. Got a few questions here. First, from AS, why do you think the Fed reduced QE to $8 billion per day, and what are the implications of that? Well, first off, it's interesting, right? It speaks to an anchoring, the anchoring bias concept. $8 billion a day sounds like a pretty sharp drop, and it is a pretty sharp drop, but it's still $40 billion a week, so you're still talking about $160 billion a month, which is an order of magnitude larger than the biggest it ever got last time around. But the broader point, I think, is an important one that AS raised, which is it is tapering. And so why are they tapering it, and what do I think the implications are? I think the first reason is you've seen a stabilization in the Treasury market. Last month, in March, mid-March, we saw the Treasury market crash. Long-dated Treasury bonds, you call up on your screens, TLT, the ETF, it crashed right alongside stocks. That's a problem. The Fed had to act aggressively, and they did. That has now stabilized, so I think that's number one. I think number two is that they are starting to get help from banks in terms of regulatory changes. There was a regulatory change 2 weeks ago, a week and a half ago. I think it went live April either 24th or 14th. The bottom line, though, is that supplementary liquidity ratios, SLRs, were suspended for treasuries for banks. So basically, it's not exactly, but to oversimplify, banks can buy as many treasuries as they want. It doesn't count against capital requirements. And so, like I said, that's not exactly the case, but directionally that's what happened. So the punchline is the Fed's now getting help from the banks without having to call it QE. I think they're also trying to normalize. I think they would like to do that. But ultimately, in terms of what it means, if the economy remains weak, as it looks like it is continuing to do, depending on the pace at which we reopen, $8 billion a day is likely not enough. And so, to get the Fed, to get the markets turning back around, we saw the Fed balance sheet grow at a $20 trillion annual rate, nearly 100% of annual GDP rate over the last 6 weeks. To me, that's probably more the bogey. And so my guess is $8 billion a day is not enough. We probably see some more of this risk off in the short run that would force them to begin upscaling that. Next question is from GG. Will you discuss the implications for the dollar with the introduction of a new Chinese digital currency? I think it's a very potentially important development, and that's not me saying that. That's a couple different people whose views I greatly respect telling me to pay attention to this, and so I'd encourage you to do the same. I'm still digging on it, but what I would say is that it would make it possible to act outside the dollar system in a relatively efficient manner. It would be a closed system within China's own borders. More importantly, if they rolled it out along the Belt and Road Initiative and how fast they did so. China is the world's factory, and so it gives them an option of basically setting up a company store, if you will, where they could have this closed system digital currency that was good for Chinese goods, basically a self-contained trade region and with its own clearing currency systems. The steps between here and there I still think have a ways to go. However, it can be rolled out relatively quickly in theory, and so it's definitely worth watching. It also would have potentially very important geopolitical implications, as anything does as it relates to the dollar and reserve currency status. From NS, could you explain the relation of rising S&P 500 relative to TLT and why it's a matter of U.S. national security? And from FC, 1995 changes to legislation made by Clinton relating to that. As directly as I can. Personal consumption expenditures, or PCE, is 2/3 of U.S. GDP. It's all kinds of consumption. Net capital gains plus taxable IRA distribution are about 200% of annual growth in personal consumption expenditures. And what that means is that unless stocks are rising, it's almost a mathematical certainty that GDP can't rise. Consumption can't rise, and GDP therefore likely can't rise. And so given our levels of debt, if GDP isn't rising, we have a problem, as we're seeing now. And so that's why I say it's a matter of national security. Additionally, when you look at the tax base of the United States, about 60%, 60% of taxes on the individual income side are paid by the top 5% of taxpayers. That's about 30% of overall taxes. These people aren't making all that money on cash wages. A lot of that is tied to incentive comp, stock options, restricted stock, which is totally separate from the taxable IRA distributions and from the net capital gains, because all that stock comp generally is taxed as ordinary income. And so what you can see very clearly is stocks are incredibly important to be rising to drive tax receipts and to drive consumption and therefore to drive GDP, which you have to make the Treasury debt payable. The legislation that sort of kicked all this off was signed by President Bill Clinton back in '95, and it made cash compensation to executives over $1 million per year non-deductible to the corporation. However, it exempted incentive comp. And so guess what happened? If you go to all your charts showing when the wealth gap and income gap blew apart, it was already widening, but when it blew apart, shortly after Clinton signed this legislation, and that's why it makes the stock market a matter of national security that stocks rise against TLT over time. From EL, in your opinion, what is the possibility of markets being shut down if we get another market crash? I think the odds are pretty low. I think we have our answer of what will happen, and that is the Fed will grow their balance sheet at a $20 or $30 trillion annual rate again until stock markets go back up. And it's intellectually offensive and it's blunt, but I think that's the world we're in now. From JJ, is there any way to reverse the damage or L damage done by monetary policy, overspending, intervention that doesn't include a crash or depression? Yeah, I think there is. I think we can print or monetize debts, and I think, quite frankly, that's the direction that has been chosen, the direction we're going. There's another option. It's very morbid, but you asked. So if sovereign entitlements in Western social democracies no longer had to be paid because a quorum or a majority of the over 65 crowd passed away suddenly and never collected their entitlements, that would, in theory, be another way out of this. It's not something I like to think about, but mathematically, it would be another way out. I think the more likely is the print monetize that I think we've actually started down the road of. And then the final question for tonight from Mary Chapman. Hi, Mary. My read of Weimar and the revolutionary France hyperinflations reveals massive money printing with prices rising unevenly in the economies. Then suddenly everything costs an order of magnitude higher. Do you see this repeating in the USA for 20 or 21, or will it differ due to very high debt? I don't think we see a broad hyperinflation in the U.S. I do think we could see hyperinflation in gold terms. In other words, gold goes a lot higher this cycle. I think that's very possible. And I do think we'll see a sharp increase in inflation by the end of this cycle. I think the way to think about it is ultimately when we think about the debt, there's a lot of people focused on this debt and that debt is deflationary. And I think that that's right. With that said, we haven't had a sovereign debt bubble globally in 100 years, and particularly in the Western countries. And this is the part I think a lot of the debt deflationists are missing, which is that once a central bank decides it's not going to let that sovereign default on that sovereign debt, then whether they or even not let that debt decline in price, as we're seeing in the U.S. and elsewhere with the capping of yields, they've chosen inflation. That's the choice they have made. They can either let the debt default, they can let rates rise, or they can cap rates and not let debt default and grow their balance sheets, and they've chosen inflation. So it's a path. There's going to be fits and starts, particularly as it ties back to the point we made earlier of the tapering that we've seen since March. But ultimately, the Fed has chosen. They are not going to let Treasury debt default. European central banks are not going to let the debt default. China, Japan, the debt's not going to be allowed to default. And therefore, the question, in my view, of when we swing from a deflationary mindset to inflationary mindset is when some quorum of the market realizes that these balance sheets are growing. If debt to GDP globally is 320% of GDP, at what point do markets begin to realize that 322% of GDP that global debt is actually the price target for global central bank balance sheets, unless we get a recovery? And so that is, once you get that recognition of, oh my gosh, they'll go to 320% of GDP if they have to as a group, I need to own anything but government debt. Then you get the government debt put to the central banks. And then mortgage bonds spreads blow out, and those get all put to the central banks. And then corporate spreads blow out, and those all get put to the central banks. And then junk, and that gets put. So it's a process, and I think you have to watch each step of the process. I think the key takeaway is that the choice was made. The debt's not going to be allowed to default. We're going to cap the yields at politically expedient levels. And that's the first step of this path. So let's watch from here. And that does it for tonight. So thank you, everyone, for tuning in. As usual, if you enjoyed these updates and want further updates from us, please go to FFTT-LLC.com. Check out Tree Rings. Our product has been getting a lot of great feedback. And so check that out. In the meantime, everyone stay safe out there and have a great weekend and rest of your weekend, I guess. And we'll talk with you all soon. Take care, everybody.